Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor today to open the proceedings of our Ambassadors Roundtable. And you will have noticed that our guest of honor to my right bears really no observable resemblance to the photo of our luncheon speaker that is in your invitation. The reason for that is that she's busy and was unable to be with us today. So Ambassador Bill Taylor, to my right, the Vice President for Russia and Europe of the U.S. Institute of Peace down the street, is going to do today, on actually several weeks' notice, since we anticipated this possibility with Ambassador Mark Carlos' busy schedule, what he did about 2 months ago on a few minutes' notice, and that is substitute for her in a speech here at the Metropolitan Hall. It would be churlish to suggest in Ukraine's dire times of trouble right now, in its moment of supreme national crisis, that Ambassador Taylor should solicit a contract with the embassy as a substitute speaker on a regular basis. Maybe that's something that, you know, when things are more normal, times are better, he could explore, but maybe the demand would have slacked off by then. In any case, for the present moment, Ambassador Taylor is, of course, best known for his 2 stints heading the embassy in Kyiv. First as ambassador in 2006 to 2009, and more recently as technically chargé d'affaires, although I think everyone considered him ambassador, of course, in 2019. I used to work on the country of Bolivia and said that its national motto could well be "where no good deed goes unpunished." That turns also to be a good motto for Washington, because for that last good deed that Bill did in 2019, he, of course, was dragged into the first Trump impeachment imbroglio on Capitol Hill. But Bill's career is a long and distinguished one in American diplomatic service, where he has served previously in trouble spots not related to Ukraine, in Afghanistan, in charge of both international and U.S. assistance to Afghanistan and in Iraq, and in numerous other portfolios. But we'll concentrate today on Ukraine, and Bill will grace us with some observations. I'm sure they'll be every bit as trenchant as what he had to share here 2 months ago, after we introduce ourselves to you.
Thank you. This is quite a distinguished group here. I'm honored to be able to address you.
Let me just start with why I think Ukraine's important. I don't have to go into great detail for this group, but the order that you all served, the order that kept the peace in Europe for 69 years, 45 to 2014, shredded in 2014 when the Russians invaded for the first time. And in my view, that order, valuable as it was, has some lessons for us. It has some scope for us to return to that order. A respect for sovereignty, a respect for borders, peaceful resolution of disputes. We know the Helsinki principles that guided that order. Totally violated by Tim's friend, the Putin, and will not be able to regain that or any semblance of that order, in my view, until Ukraine is solved, until the Russians get out of Ukraine. So in the grand scheme of international relations that this group deals with, I think it's important. I think Ukraine's important for that first reason. There's another reason that I described that Ukraine's important, and for me, and it's more of a moral issue, and that is Ukraine's on the front line. Ukraine as we all know, was invaded, unprovoked, unjustified, because they wanted to be sovereign and make their own decisions. And they're fighting the Russians without, there are no NATO troops, there are no American troops. There are a lot of American weapons, but no troops there. They're on the front line. And they're defending themselves for sure. They're defending their land, their territorial integrity, their sovereignty, their ability to be a nation that they want to be, which is a democratic nation. Let's be clear. That's what they are. Their values are very similar to ours. And they're defending those values. They're defending their land, but they're defending their values as well. And they are ours. And they're fighting for us. They are fighting for us, for Europeans. We've got people who served in European nations around this table, Eastern European in particular. And that fight is what the Ukrainians are fighting on our behalf. We all support, Americans support our military. We support our troops because they're on the front lines. They're on the front lines, they're fighting for us. We support them. We should support the Ukrainians for the same reason, that they're on the front lines and they're fighting our values. So that's why I think it's important. I would like to have this conversation. Let me just do a little bit on kind of where we are today. And we're talking a little bit about, again, Tim's favorite dictator. We made a speech 2 days ago for Victory Day. And it was interesting what he did not say. There was a lot of speculation that President Putin was going to either double down and mobilize and declare war on Ukraine or more, or he was going to back down in some sense, that is, declare victory and try to make the case to his people, to the Russians, that he'd accomplished what he set out to do. And therefore, he had succeeded, he had won. He didn't do either of those. There was no doubling down, there was no backing down, but there was no kind of nuclear weapons saber rattling that we anticipated, that a lot of people anticipated. As I say, there's no mobilization. There was no aircraft overhead. It was a real surprise. I mean, Victory Day, many people have probably been to some of those Victory Days, and it's a big deal. It's an amazing show, and this was not a very big show. It was not a very big speech, and that suggests to me that President Putin has gotten himself into a bind. He's painted himself into a corner. He made a big mistake on the 24th of February this year when he decided to invade. Maybe he waited until the last minute to decide, and a lot of people thought he wouldn't do this. They thought he was just kind of bluffing, or he was just trying to intimidate President Zelensky or President Biden. He invaded and thought that the Ukrainians, since they're not really a nation, we know that President Putin doesn't think the Ukraine's really a nation of people, that they wouldn't resist. B, that they're really just little Russians, the Ukrainians, in Putin's eyes. And therefore, being Russian, really, they would probably welcome the troops that were coming down from Belarus, down the river, down towards Kyiv, and that President Putin had expected. He thought that he'd be able to be in Kyiv in 3 days, replace President Zelensky one way or the other, and be able to do what he'd been always after in his mind, which is to dominate Ukraine. Putin had in mind, I think still has in mind, that he can be a great Russian leader, historic Russian leader, if he controls Ukraine. Without controlling Ukraine, he can't be. And so that's what's driving him to do this. And he may have thought he was running out of time. we can talk about kind of why he did this then, but every day that went by, every week, every month, every year that went by, Ukraine was farther and farther away from Russia. Ukraine was farther and farther into Europe, into European institutions. Putin talks about NATO. He was also talking about the EU. So that was driving President Putin to make a big mistake, to make this blunder, which he's now paying the price for. Russian people are not, they're happy they have Crimea, but they're not willing to mobilize, which is what some people thought Putin would do, and he didn't. They're not willing to pay the price that they're paying economically. Many Russian soldiers are coming back dead to villages and towns across Russia. Estimates are 10,000 to 20,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in Ukraine in 2.5 months. 10 to 20,000 are the estimates. In Afghanistan, the Russians lost 15,000 in 10 years. So they've probably already lost more in 2.5 months than they lost in 10 years in Afghanistan. All to say that Putin has made a mistake and he's not sure how to get out of it. Let me just say a couple of words about what the scenarios are on how this might end. And then a bigger question for this group on the structure, the architecture, where we go from here. On the scenarios, and then you promised conversation. We can have this. Good. The scenarios are, the likely scenario is kind of a simmering conflict without a resolution. I won't say a frozen conflict because that implies static lines, but the Russians and the Ukrainians will probably continue to resist. The Ukrainians will continue to resist. The Russians will continue to push. The Russians have a lot of resources, not very well organized, but they've got a lot of stuff. The Ukrainians have a lot of spirit. It turns out they've got more volunteers for their army, the Ukrainians, than the Russians do. The Russians are having a hard time getting soldiers. The Russians are, as we know, looking for Libyans and Syrians and private Wagner Group, the private sector. They're looking for Belarusians. Belarusians are not interested in helping out. So the Russians Putin's got a problem on manpower. The Ukrainians don't. And Ukrainians now have support from the United States and the rest of NATO in a very big way. That didn't start out that way. And we'll see if we're too late. I think we're not. I think the flow of weapons that are coming, the flow that's now coming into to Ukraine can, if continued, maybe even accelerated, allow the Ukrainians to at least in this first scenario, hold on, defend, blunt, stop the Russian invasion. They in this first scenario. And then the question is it kind of like, is the scenario like North Korea, South Korea, where there was not a treaty, there was kind of a truce, but tension across the lines. That's a scenario. There's another scenario. Several others. One is a collapse by the Russian army. Russian army is on the ground not doing well. The Russian army got beaten in north of Kyiv. They got run out of Kyiv, run out of Ukraine for that matter, pushed back into Belarus and to Russia with severe damage to these Russian military units. Some of those units are now being pulled around to the east for an offensive that has been broadcast, has been highlighted, has been forecast for weeks now, and they're still preparing because those units are really beaten up. In this scenario, the Russian military, in particular on the ground, continues to do badly, and indeed is beaten up so badly that they collapse. And the Ukrainians push them back. Then do they push them all the way out of Ukraine in a way that I talked about right at the beginning, where they get the Ukrainians out in order to reestablish the order? Or do they go back to the borders of February 23rd, 2022, before this latest invasion? In either of those two cases, either the simmering conflict, the kind of North Korea, South Korea one, or this one where the Ukrainians actually succeed with the weapons that we're providing, and the Russians continue to do badly on the ground. And by the way, the Russians run out of precision-guided munitions. The estimates are that the cruise missiles that have done so much damage to Ukraine up until now are almost gone. Down to like 20% of what they started off with, and they can't replace them. The Russians can't replace these precision-guided munitions because this export ban on components, on electronic components that the West has placed on Russia, keep them from replacing these munitions. They also, by the way, keep them from replacing the tanks and the trucks. There's a lot that these components are having a real impact on the Russian ability to manufacture things. So there's that. Then there's the wild card scenarios that we talked a little bit about. And this is the Tim scenario where Putin's somehow gone. Putin's somehow replaced. I don't know how to put any probabilities on this. Probably not high. Probably not a high probability, but not zero. And then there's the wild card of nuclear weapons use. If Putin is pushed in that second scenario that I mentioned, that where the Ukrainians do extremely well, some argue that Putin might well resort to some tactical nuclear weapon. We can talk about that. I don't think that's probable either. But as we know, we have to take that seriously. And again, this group can help think that one through. So those are the kind of scenarios. And then the final question for this group is, after the war, the Ukrainians, by the way, they don't say after the war. The Ukrainians say after the victory. They are sure, and they are sure to a person that they're going to win one way or the other that I just described. There are other scenarios. Let me just be clear. I'm sure people around this table can think of those. But the Ukrainians are confident that with the support of the West, in particular the United States, and in particular these weapons, and not just the weapons, but the ammunition, the fuel, the financing, we're providing a fair amount of financing to keep their government going, to keep paying soldiers. So with that support, the Ukrainians can make this. They can keep this going, and in that case, they are an independent nation. I mean, our goal should be Ukraine as a sovereign, independent nation. How much of it they have, how much of it they maintain, how much they keep, how much the Russians pull back out of, to be discussed really by the Ukrainians and the Russians. But a sovereign, independent Ukraine is what should be our goal. Secretary Austin, I think, didn't get it quite right, in my view, about his goal. His goal is to bleed the Russians and make them weaker so they can never do this again. That may be a side benefit, but the goal should be to have Ukraine succeed. Ukraine should be able to be a sovereign, independent nation, a viable one, and viability means they've got Odessa, they've got a port. Again, we can come back all to that. But after the victory, as the Ukrainians say, what does Europe look like? What does Europe look like? Europe, after the victory, in that scenario, there'll be a stronger NATO. There may be a larger NATO. And if there's a larger NATO, by the way, the Baltics are more defensible. NATO can defend the Baltics if Finland and Sweden are members. Hard right now, but still will be there. But a larger, stronger, more united, more capable, more confident NATO on the one hand. On the other hand, Russia will be diminished, Russia will be weaker and getting progressively weaker as the sanctions continue. I imagine that the sanctions will continue. And that will have increasingly negative effects on the Russian economy over time. Putin, at least for the Western world, will be a pariah. I can't imagine President Biden ever sitting down with a man he's called a thug or a killer or a war criminal or even genocidal. It's hard to imagine, and probably other world leaders will have the same attitude. So Russia will be diminished, weakened, and then the question is in the middle, like Ukraine. So you got Russia here, and you got a stronger NATO here. How does Ukraine secure itself? What structure can we even think about putting into place that will, again, go back to this international order that kept the peace for that 69 years? What kind of order, what kind of structure, what kind of architecture could go in there? And President Macron, over the past couple of days, has talked about some middle ground, that would include the EU, include the Brits, who are not members of the EU anymore, maybe include the Ukrainians and Moldovans, and then the Russian on the other side. This is to say that there's thought being given. People are thinking about this question of how Europe looks, how Europe can be secure after the victory. That's probably longer than I meant to be, but I'd love to hear thoughts about that. Hopefully something there is controversial. I imagine there's going to be some arguments there. And yes, sir, I knew.
So if you'd like to ask a question, put your card up. And we'll start with Ambassador Sedgwick, then we'll go to the Senate.
I was wondering, I think Bill Browder was quoted in the Financial Times as estimating that something like 80% of the funds going to ministries in Russia are stolen. So the fact that you see soldiers stealing like computers, and does that reflect, is it like the Afghan army where they're not being paid, and they're trying to siphon off gas just to be paid some dollars? Is that what's happening?
I think the failure of the Russian army, and indeed even the Navy. So the Army and the Navy are not doing well. The Air Force and the missile forces, they've done well. They've used most of their weapons, but they've been effective at taking out airports and fuel depots and rail lines, those kind of things. But the Army and the Navy, as we know, the Ukrainians manufactured those Neptune missiles that took out that flagship. Those were Ukrainian missiles that not American or British, or they designed and manufactured those and took out that flagship. A real embarrassment for Putin, which is another reason he couldn't declare victory 2 days ago. But the explanation for why the army doing so badly, unexpectedly badly, is exactly that. That is, the equipment was not maintained. The maintenance was not done. There were equipment in warehouses looted, not turned on every couple of years or every couple of months. And the soldiers not well trained, soldiers not told that they were even going into Ukraine in a lot of cases. Well, there's a combination. There's conscripts, and then there's contract soldiers. No. Then there's the Wagner Group. Then there's the actual private sector, the Wagner Group. No, but in the Russian army, there are conscripts who are not supposed to go abroad. And when Putin heard, he was told that actually some of our conscripts did go into Ukraine. He got angry and yelled at Shoigu, the defense minister, about that. But so they're not supposed to go, but the contractors are allowed to be sent. It's like volunteer army, and they are the ones going in there. But again, not well trained, not told. Some of the I don't know if it's conscripts or contract or both showed up in Ukraine thought they had been told that they were going on an exercise, that they were, conducting a military exercise. That all of a sudden they show up in Ukraine actually getting shot at. So that military has not performed well. And the other thing is also true. Ukrainian military, very well, amazingly well. And they're fighting again, as I say, they're fighting for their land. They're fighting for their homes. They're fighting for their families. They're fighting for their independence. They know what it's like to live under the Russians. They don't want to do that again.
So Jim Rosenberg.
Thank
And
you.
then Louise Oliver next.
Thank you. I think NATO and the US government have obviously done a great job over the period of the fact that the US government put out, and the British area put out the intelligence they had before the war to try the narrative was a stroke of brilliance. I've only been to Ukraine once, and it was a journalist, not to Kyiv. And so I know very little about Ukraine. It seems as though the US government, maybe NATO governments, experts like yourself, and I'm not going to speak for you, that's what I asked the question, have been surprised about how good the Ukrainians have been at fighting back. There was this impression you had that the US government thought that Putin might have been right and they might have collapsed. How did we get it so wrong about Ukraine?
It's so interesting. You're exactly right. I wrote, so I can say back in 2014, I wrote a piece in some paper, and the headline was, Ukraine will fight. But that was not the majority view. The intelligence in the recent case was good in most cases, in most aspects, but missed one big thing. The intelligence was very good about the Russian 120,000, 150,000 arrayed around 3 borders of Ukraine, and was also very good saying that we really think they're going to invade. The U.S. intelligence said that, and the British intelligence both said that. And we said that to the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians, we were passing intelligence to them, to the Ukrainian government. I was in Kyiv most recently at the end of January, 3 weeks before the invasion. I sat down and talked with President Zelensky, whom I'd worked with when I was there the second time, and also talked to opposition leaders, talked to a lot. And you may recall there was this debate between Zelensky and Biden about whether imminent, imminent was the controversial word, and Zelensky didn't like this imminent business because he was trying to keep some calm among Ukrainians, and President Biden, reflecting the intelligence, said it's imminent. When I was sitting in Zelensky's office in January, he was working on his military. He was working on increasing the size and increasing the pay. He wanted to double the pay for the military. So he knew it was not like he didn't acknowledge the threat. But the Ukrainians and a lot of others didn't think that Putin would actually pull the trigger. And there were a lot of people. I have to confess, I would say I was in print in 2014 saying the Ukrainians will fight, but I was on some Sunday show, and the guy asked me, okay, this is like probably in January. He said, are they going to invade? And I said, well, I think there's a 45% chance that they will invade. Problem is, there's a 55% chance, I said, that they won't. So I was wrong about that. I was wrong. Close. I was right about 45%. But then they missed the Ukrainian side. You're exactly right. The U.S. intelligence thought, and probably the Russian intelligence thought, and that the Ukrainians would not put up that kind of a fight, and they did, as we know, incredibly so. So there was a lot they got right about the Russians, and a lot they got wrong about the Ukrainians.
As promised, Louise Oliver.
A quick follow-up on Jim's question, which is, it strikes me as very interesting that our intelligence community got Afghanistan so wrong. They were going to fight. They collapsed in 24 hours, and they got Ukraine wrong. They weren't going to fight, and they had. I think that raises a certain issue that ought to be looked at by the intelligence agencies, which brings me to my question. Recently, we've seen and heard members of the Biden administration boasting, literally boasting, about how we gave intelligence that enabled God knows what, 12 Russian generals, or how many Russian generals were killed, and it was because of our intelligence that the ship was blown up, et cetera, et cetera. As we go around boasting like that, doesn't it give a certain amount of credence to Putin to say that this is a proxy war, and that he's really fighting the US, that the US is going to through the Ukrainians?
You're absolutely, it's a mistake. It's a mistake to be talking about our intelligence being responsible for deaths of generals, our intelligence being responsible for sinking that flagship, the Moskva. That's a mistake for the reason that you said. But it's also, it actually goes back to the Ukrainians. I spent a lot of time with Ukrainian intelligence services out in some of their very high-end collection areas. They're very good. The Ukrainians very good. They got intelligence from the United States. They get intelligence from the Brits. They get intelligence from the Poles. They probably get intelligence from the Baltics. Put that all together with their excellent intelligence to make these decisions. And that's what, so all this boasting, which I think is stopped. I think the message is, your message has gotten to them, zip it. And I think it's zipped, but damage may well be done.
Governor Blanche.
I'm encouraged by your optimism about the end game here, whatever it's going to be. I really am. I've known a lot of Ukrainians.
For what it's worth, I just say, for what it's worth.
I'm looking ahead. Everybody always looks at the United Nations as not capable of dealing with something like this. And I'm not suggesting we abolish the UN. If we didn't have a UN, we'd have to create one. The question is there a reform of some sort, perhaps with the Security Council, that could be developed in the future? Maybe 2/3 vote of Security Council. I mean, I realize the Soviets boycotted it in Korea, so that's how we went ahead. But could we have an effective United Nations force? Is that realistic? What would we do in the future?
I'll give you my answer, but this is a great question, I think, for everybody sitting around this room. I'd love to get other people's thoughts about this. Can we do that? Is that allowed at this, on this format? So people, then I decide that I'd love to hear the answer to this question from as many people who've got opinions. So I've raised this question about the Security Council being broken. Well, we saw Zelensky when he was addressing the Security Council. He came in there and just blasted them, roasted them harshly. He said, this organization was created in 1947 for this exact reason, to stop wars. And you failed, he said. He said, you have failed. And if you keep failing, what's the purpose? A fair question on the Security Council. Now, that said, there's a lot of good work that the UN agencies do. There are a lot of good things that we see some humanitarian work that is being done right now. I think the UN, Guterres actually was instrumental in getting some of those civilians out of Mariupol. He was able to negotiate humanitarian corridors. But that's because he didn't need the Russians okay. He didn't need the Russians' approval to do that kind of stuff. So I'm not sure there's a good answer to your question about is a reform of the Security Council possible? There have been some. There was a vote, I think last week and a half ago, and this was the extent of the reform of the Security Council. The vote for the General Assembly was, if a nation, one of the P5, vetoes a Security Council resolution, they have to go to the General Assembly and explain it. That was the reform. A good reform. You didn't even have to do that before. That was not even a requirement before. So you could veto it, and that was it. But now you have to. That said, I don't know if that fixes the problem on the Security Council. Some people suggest, you hinted at it. You might just walk away and do something else. I've heard people suggest that. I'm not suggesting that yet, but okay. So how to reform the UN? Is it reformable? Is it worth saving? Is it, okay, thank you very much.
So in terms of a historical precedent that I think bears on the current situation, when the nascent UN Security Council for the first time denounced the aggressive war when North Korea invaded into South Korea, Russia, the Soviet Union at that time, they walked out of meetings. And they claimed that walking out of the meetings was tantamount to a veto. However, the remainder of the UN Security Council instead convened and said, no, it is not a veto. You simply were not present. But you have this P5 structure because these were the most powerful countries in the wake of the Second World War, and it was thought necessary to have them in there in order to have muscle behind the otherwise hapless and weak UN. And so in terms of Russia being a P5 member, obviously that creates issues in terms of the current situation, because there's no way that they would allow the remainder of the UN Security Council to do anything. And they probably learned from their lesson in terms of the Korean War and would veto anything. There is the General Assembly option of a Uniting for Peace resolution. That is one option that exists. It's arguable that the current P5 does not represent the most powerful countries in the world, like say France, for example. Does France still belong in the P5 or not? But the original idea behind it was to provide the muscle to actually be able to prevent or deter or mitigate aggressive wars.
So is it reformable?
Maybe partially.
Yes, please. You've got an answer to this question.
Having spent 5 years
All right.
at UNESCO, the United Nations. The reason that UNESCO got reformed was because the United States left. And they wanted the United States back so badly, they were going to do reforms. That does not exist with the Security Council. And the idea of making a speech to the General Assembly, well, I mean, a speech is a speech. They give very good speeches. And you've got not just Russia, you've had the complications of China and the relationship between those countries. The chances of having what might be described as serious reforms, in my view, are extremely low, and not exist at all. They've tried to do a little bit of reform by having temporary members of the Security Council, people that serve, 2 years or whatever it is, on a rotating basis or whatever. That again was the response of the Security Council to enlarge it or to make it more representative of today's world, perhaps. But those are not the veto wielding members. So having seen what I saw at UNESCO, I would say the chances of serious reform of the UN are vanishingly small.
Any disagreements on it?
Going back to long ago studies in international organizations, there's no way to expel a permanent member of the Security Council from the UN. So you can't, and there's no way to curtail their veto. No one in their right mind who enjoyed such power would ever give it up. So you stop that. It's that simple.
So do you walk away? I mean, do you do what we did in UNESCO? We left. We leave that building up on Turtle Bay and leave the Russians and Chinese talking.
But we know what happened when the Russians were absent. That's maybe not such a good idea. And it is useful in a lot of other contexts.
I agree with
Just
that.
not in the context.
I agree with that.
Just not in the context where there is a direct clash of interests between the permanent members.
Have we-
Yes,
to that
yes,
topic?
thank you.
Let's bounce to Governor Young.
Well, I was in Kyiv in May of last year, 21, and went down to Mariupol, went down to Azov, did all those things. And I left Ukraine under no doubt that they would fight and that they would return. But what I'm going to ask you to do is to think speculate on what you think the end game is here, because I think there's not a lot of discussion about that. My impression is that right now, after all the war crimes and rapes and deportations of people and destruction, that, you know, the Ukrainians are pretty annoyed right now.
Well, Jim, how do you really feel?
So I have a hard time believing that they're just gonna push the Russians out. Of what, really? Because when I was at OSCE, Donbass was divided and we were dealing with that every day. That was a controversy, and it looks like Putin his plan B is to take over the whole Donbass, hold it, take over the whole southern part of Ukraine and all the Sea of Azov and all that area down there, and hold it, and then use that with Crimea to attach that to Russia, just the way that they tend to do. And I guess that, to my way of thinking, is they may be winning. I mean, I don't see anything right now in discussions that say that they're going to be driven out of it. That's a win for them. They're not losing, they're winning. And so then the other question is, if on the other hand, you take the position, Bill, that the Ukrainians are so good and they're so supported that they're not only going to drive the Russians out of Donbass, which would be new, by the way, brand new to do that. They're also going to go over there and drive them back into the Sea of Azov. Then what? Is that so? The Russians get to say, "Well, just kidding," and go home, right? And oh well, sorry about that, and they go home. I don't think Ukraine is going to settle for that. So my question to you is, where do we go from here? What happens if the armies keep fighting the way you've been describing? What's winning and losing here?
It's a great question. Winning. I don't think Russia wins. I don't think Putin wins unless, in his own mind, unless he controls Ukraine. So controlling Donbass, Kherson, Crimea, that bridge, it's a step. But it's not. It doesn't get him to. It doesn't give him control of Ukraine. Even if he does control Donbass, Kherson, Crimea, and claims it, no one recognizes it, but nonetheless he claims it, like he's recognized, Donetsk and Luhansk. No one else recognizes that, and the Ukrainians never give up their claim to that whole area. They may not fight for it. They may not use military to go after Donetsk, or Luhansk, Donbass, or Crimea, even less likely to go after Crimea on a military basis. So they maintain the claim, and they agree to disagree on this. But in that situation, the free Ukraine, the rest of Ukraine, develops like South Korea did. That is, it joins the EU. It develops its economy. It maintains, again, if they don't take Odessa, I mentioned that, the Ukrainians, to be viable, probably need Odessa. They need a port. But if they have that, if it's viable, if it's sovereign, if it's independent, that is not under the control of Russia, that's the goal, seems to me, then they can develop. They can develop their economy, their democracy. We talked about the corruption that they need to deal with as well. They can do that. And like the East Germany, West Germany, West Germany was a member of NATO, let's be clear, and they helped form what became the EU, even while the Soviets controlled East Germany. And in the end, we know what happened. This is to say that a free, independent, sovereign Ukraine, even if it's not whole, even if it doesn't push all the way back to the borders, even if it doesn't reclaim all its land, it can still develop economically, politically. In that scenario, it could even join NATO if NATO were to agree on that, some kind of security, or there's some other security guarantees that the Americans or the Brits or somebody could give to that free Ukraine that would deter Putin in his next attempt, because in my view, Putin is not going to give up. He'll be back, exactly as you said, Governor. He'll be back 2 years, 3 years down the line. And if there's a security guarantee from the Americans and the Brits and the Poles, just say, to Ukraine, that if Putin attacks again, they'll be there with Article 5 or something like that. That would deter him. That would allow Ukraine to develop. Absolutely right. So the Ukrainians know that. The Ukrainians gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. Good to see you, sir. See you later. Whoops. No problem. You said you were going to do that. Yeah. So the Ukrainians are looking for security guarantees, not assurances. And what they got in the Budapest memorandum were assurances. And those assurances, not treaty, not legally binding, didn't go to the Senate, whichever direction here it is. And so we're not law. Ukrainians know that. They're not going for that. They want security guarantees. They want something that goes to the Senate. They want something that is legally binding, a treaty that says if we're attacked, if we Ukrainians are attacked, then the Americans and the Brits and the Poles, whoever, will also give those guarantees. We'll be there. When I mentioned this, by the way, I don't know that we can ever do that, but I've had a couple of opportunities to brief congressmen and senators about this. And when I mention the business about security guarantees and 67 senators having to vote for an Article 5 kind of agreement, eyes get big. But they start. No one runs screaming from the room. They don't head for the door. But that's what we're going to be thinking about. I think that's what we're going to have to be thinking about. Europeans have already said we'll contribute as well. There'll be funds. There's funds already set up. But if it's $500 billion, if it's $500 billion, 200 billion of that could come from the Russians. And the way it could come, right now, so we have now sanctioned the Russians in a way that has never been done before by freezing the central bank reserves. No, we and the international community has never used that sanction before. And it's the big one. People talk about SWIFT being the economic nuclear sanction. No, it's the freezing of the central bank reserves. So they had reserves, 600 billion, the Russians. They never thought that anybody would ever go after it, but 300 billion of that, $300 billion were in New York and London and Basel and Tokyo and other places around the world. And those 300 billion are frozen. The lawyers, there are probably a couple in this room, I suspect, will tell you that it's hard to get at that money. It's hard to actually, it'll take time to get at that money. However, what we could say to the Russians at the end, after the victory, is, look, we got 300 billion of your money. If you take 200 billion of that 300 billion that you still have and put it into this reconstruction fund, we'll give you the 300 million back. So all to say that you're right to ask where this comes from. People are thinking about that, and there's some ideas about where that would go.
Stuart.
Ukraine had a reputation of being very corrupt. Zelensky won that. Has he been able to change that? Has that any different? And what do the Russians people know what's happening?
The last question, I think not much. The Russian people are barely aware. They're going to start being aware. I mean, the economic situation that the Russian people are going to experience going to get worse and worse. And I mentioned this 10 to 20,000 Russians who have already died in Ukraine are going to come back for burial, and that's going to start having effect. So they're here, and that message, those messages will get around on that. So they don't know much yet, and opinion polls, which are unreliable, I'm sure, but they say 80% of the Russians agree with Putin on support of this war, which is disappointing. Is really disappointing. Your first question about corruption, we were talking about this corruption as well. All post-Soviet nations were corrupt. because of the nature of the Soviet Union. People around this table know this better than I. When the Soviet Union imploded, some nations, in particular Warsaw Pact nations, actually made some changes, made some reform pretty quickly. Poland actually did pretty well. I don't know about Hungary. You can, yeah, pluses and minuses. I think there's a lot of pluses and minuses. But in Russia and in Ukraine, oligarchs, or not even oligarchs, at the time they weren't even oligarchs. They're business people, mostly men, businessmen, grabbed state-owned enterprises and came out very wealthy. Those oligarchs in Ukraine, but also in Russia, are the source of corruption. And you're exactly right. So Zelensky, I don't know if you've seen this. Zelensky had never had elective office before he was elected in 2019. This is the first time he's ever been run for anything. He was elected with 73% of the vote in a free and fair election. And he ran on a two-plank platform. One was end the war, which had been going on for 5 years at that time, and clean up corruption, in particular the oligarchs. And before he was elected, he was the star. He was the head of an entertainment company, and wrote and starred in a series called Servant of the People, which you can see on Netflix, and it's subtitled in English. And in this series, he is elected president of Ukraine, and he runs on a platform of anti-corruption. The reason it is, so he starts out as just the first episode of the first series. He's a high school teacher in present day Ukraine, or in 2014 or whatever. He's a high school teacher, humble, not very unassuming. But he gets really riled up after class one afternoon about corruption in the nation, corruption in Ukraine, and he starts yelling and screaming. And it's foul mouth, and one of his students, captures it on the phone, and of course it goes viral, and he's elected president in this series. And then he goes after corruption, and then he runs for president, and he's elected. So all to say that he has made his business to be anti-corruption, anti-oligarch. He's succeeded largely. There's one oligarch, a guy named Kolomoisky, who has apparently got some influence over Zelensky, although he's tried to distance himself from it. He, unlike his two predecessors, Poroshenko and Yanukovych, no whiff of corruption with Zelensky. Zelensky is not after money. The previous ones were, to a large extent. And he is now, I mentioned I was in Ukraine. I was in his office on just at the end of January, 3 weeks before I talked to some of the opposition leaders too. There's Yulia Tymoshenko is another of the opposition leaders, a lot of Ukrainian leaders in opposition, and she was at that time. It was 3 weeks before the invasion. She was, he's making a mistake here. She's doing what opposition leaders do. They point out the problems of the person in the White House or in the presidency, or in this case, the president of Ukraine. As soon as they invaded, as soon as the Russians invaded on the 24th of February, they all fell in behind them. The opposition across the country, Zelensky has 95% support from across the, where do you get that? So if he wins, when he wins, as he says, we'll see if he continues to do what he's started out doing and going after the oligarchs.
So we have about 10 minutes remaining. Try to get everybody in. Dr. Bosch.
Thank you. Thank you. We all realize the importance of the intelligence community because they help us in solving some of these mysteries. And with their previous history of, most currently, of failures that have impacted our policies, I just wanted to make a statement of the importance of educating our future members of our intelligence community and understanding basic geography, basic history, and cultures. It is not a surprise that the Ukrainians are resilient. And if people had studied that, they would perhaps not have made this most recent mistake. And my question, sir, why is China silent right now?
China is trying to walk this fine line, so Putin goes to Beijing just before the invasion for the Olympics, and Putin and President Xi signed this 5,000 word document that says, there's no limit to our partnership, no limit to our cooperation, no limit to our friendship. Before the invasion, by the way, in that 5,000 word document, there's no mention of Ukraine. That is, the Chinese did not support, did not encourage, did not support, did not endorse an invasion. In fact, they probably opposed it. And my bet is they're having a little buyer's remorse from that 5,000 word document because the Chinese, they have big investments in Europe. It turns out that the Chinese are the single largest investor in Ukraine. And the Russians, not that big an economy. So the Russian economy is the size of Spain. And when you compare the size, an economy the size of Spain with the EU, with the United States, with Japan, there's no question about where their economic demands need to go and interests need to be. So they're being quiet. I think plus they're surprised at how badly the Russians are doing, and they're a little bit worried about maybe their own army is not as good as they thought. At least, the Russian army is supposed to be great, and it's not so good. You might have to check the Chinese army, and to see what the Ukrainians are doing. You might say, the Taiwanese might be stronger than we think. They may have made the same, intelligence failures that you just described. All to say, the Chinese seem to be having some difficulty.
Ambassador Holder.
Bill, we're running out of time, so I'm going to make mine very quick. I've been trying to get information on what's happening in Belarus. And I'm also fascinated by Viktor Orban, who has just vetoed the EU's plan to phase out all Russian oil. Could you comment on those two situations?
Sure. Well, there are other experts on Orban and Hungary, so I would be careful about that. Although I understand that they're still trying. That the EU is still trying to get Orban, maybe with an extension, maybe with an exception. 5 years, a longer time to phase out the oil out. So they haven't given up yet. But that's a problem. Orban's been very sympathetic to, even friendly with Putin for a long time. And I remember I had a good conversation with Fiona Hill, who was in the room when President Orban and President Trump were having this conversation in the White House. And Fiona just came out head and hands because Orban was telling President Trump exactly what President Putin said, what his line was. So that's a problem. But they haven't given up. Belarus, this is a harder one too. There are probably some smart people around this table on Belarus than I. Lukashenko owes everything to Putin. I mean, he would, if it weren't for Putin's backing, he would not be there. I mean, it derailed some of the trains. Apparently, there's a battalion of Belarusian soldiers who are fighting on the Ukrainian side. They've gone across the border and now fighting the Russians. So yeah, that's a complicated nation.
Ambassador Foley.
The nuclear option, can you talk, what does that mean? How are people sizing that or whatever?
Yeah, that's a really hard one. I ask this question a lot. I get asked this question a lot, and everybody who gets this, and no one's got a good answer. Bill Burns was asked, as we probably all saw about 2 weeks ago, and he said, CIA watches this very carefully. You can't discount it. You have to take it seriously. Bill Burns says, we have seen no indication that there's any change in the readiness level. There's no operational implication or effect of this higher alert that Putin said he ordered. There's no indication of that. And the CIA is very focused on that question. They watch that as closely as anything that they watch. So the bill was somewhat, I thought, reassuring on that. Nonetheless, he's also said more recently, I think the last couple of days, he said, you know, if Putin gets cornered, who knows? I mean, the guy is, who knows? So that's troubling. Still, there's no indication now, then the question is how to deter that. What should be our policy? Deterrence means sending a message to the Russians. If you even think about a tactical nuclear weapon, much less strategic, on Ukrainian soil, here's what we will do. That would be deterrence. At one end, at the high end, the deterrent message to them would be, we're going to use nuclear weapons against you if you use a tactical nuke against Ukraine. Probably not. I mean, that's just in terms of the high end, that's the highest end. Then there's below that, there could be, someone suggested this recently, that is, Mr. Putin, if you use a tactical nuclear weapon on Ukraine, we will use, the NATO nations and the United States will use one of our precision guided weapons, that is a cruise missile that can get to very precise and take out the unit that is responsible for that nuclear weapon. So there's that. That's one step down. There are, at the other end, all the way at the bottom end of the deterrence is, okay, if you do that, then we're going to put more sanctions on you, and we're going to put more weapons to the Ukrainians, and we're going to put more US forces in Eastern Europe. That is, do more of what we're now doing to try to deter. There are other gradations. So one person suggested that threshold going from conventional to nuclear, even as just a tactical demonstration, small nuclear weapon, that threshold is real. That is, it's when you do nuclear, that's it. And we would then, with all the effort that we can put in, would mobilize the world to just exclude Russia from everything. Just total pariah out of every organization, every international organization that we've all served in, every sanction, just total isolation for the, I don't know. Short answer is I don't know.
So
A concise, time is not our friend.
I'll be very brief because I've already discussed with the ambassador, my view. Now there's some discussion about his class, about his health. He's holding on to his chair, that he's reaching on the table to get up. I do that too. That he's having trouble. Did you watch him yesterday putting that thing on? He had to go upstairs. I have to go upstairs too. It's very difficult. Is he getting sick? Is he going to die soon so we don't have to figure out all this stuff that we've been talking about all day long? And that he'll go away, and Russia, which is a wonderful country, old school, an adult, a serious person will come in and save Western civilization.
good question, Tim. Thank you for.
He apparently has some health problems. Bill Burns knows the answer to that question. We've got CIA analysts who have made their careers on trying to answer that question. They still do. There's clearly some problems. Condi Rice, who was studying him over time, says he's not the same guy. Even before this latest set of symptoms that we can observe. I mean, this weirdness about his hand, so there's clearly something going on there. But in answer to your second part of your question, who will replace him? We don't. It might be as bad or worse. But most of the people I talk to say that one thing about whoever replaces him, which is encouraging, is he won't have this kind of, whoever it is, probably he, I said he, won't have the same kind of mystic obsession with Ukraine, which is what Putin has and has been encouraged to have by some of these strange people around him. So if that's the case, even if it's another nationalist or Nazi or whatever, that it won't have the, so that might mean that they could find a way to live in peace with a neighbor on your border.
So, well, Philip, you want?
Americans love to embrace stories where the good guys win, and bad guys lose. And it's appropriate to bring an event like this to an end on a happy and optimistic note. But I won't do that. Because it seems to me, and I'd like to hear what you think, that there is a built-in plan, which is called salami tactics. Take what you can and hold it while you can hold it. If that means as much as detaching Donetsk and Luhansk and Kherson and Mariupol and the rest of the southern coast of Ukraine, you leave a Ukraine that is dependent on somebody else to get its wheat crop out, which now we've learned is vital to the world, to world health and nutrition. You leave Ukraine dependent on oil exports from Russia for energy supplies, but bypassed, at least as far as Nord Stream 1 and 2 are concerned, by their main cash cow, or to get to the main cash cow, which is in Europe. And really a kind of rump country that is a hostage economically of the surrounding Russian territory that has just been detached from it. Why not say that is victory, and it'll hold me for 3 or 4 years, assuming he survives his health problems, and gives Russia a second bite at the apple down the road.
So I think,
can we accept it?
no, I think we
the
can't.
answer is cannot.
I think we cannot. I think we cannot. And I don't think the Russians can get all the way to Odessa, for example. I'm not sure they can get to Mykolaiv. But that is a key part of your scenario. That is, they need Odessa. That's what I mentioned, to be a sovereign, independent nation. They need to be able to export. Number one. So, but I don't think the Russians can. I don't think they have we talked earlier about the manpower. The soldiers. They're hurting, and they. So I'm not sure they can get there. But even if they do have that Donbass, Kherson, Crimea, they won't be. Putin won't be satisfied, and until somebody replaces him who's not so mystically obsessed with, then he'll be back. Which means that rump that you described, I described it as free Ukraine. Needs some kind of security guarantee, not assurance, but guarantee that keeps Putin from attacking again.
But not to prolong this.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that be an almost suicidal thing for the security guarantors to do? Such an entity would have practically indefensible borders, and it would be surrounded on all sides by Russia or its.
Why all sides? Why all sides? No, because now the other part of that is the Europeans are getting off of Russian gas, and they're getting off of Russian oil. Nord Stream 2 is never going to be in business. Russia is clearly an unreliable supplier. People are scrambling. Europeans are others are scrambling to find other suppliers than Russia in order to buy gas and oil from. So I don't see Russia coming out. I see, and these sanctions on microchips that keep them manufacturing hobbled stay on. As long as Putin's in office. So I see the Russians being diminished and weakened. So and if we can keep the support, you're exactly right. We need to keep the support for that rump or free Ukraine to enable them, again, the Poles really want a free Ukraine they don't want a Russia on their border. They want a free Ukraine. There's a lot of reasons that Europeans and Americans, as I said at the beginning, want to see Russia defeated, and more important, better said, I should say, Ukraine to prevail.
So
that's optimistic. Did I say what ended on an optimistic note?